So, for those I haven't met yet, I'm Jenny, one of the registrars who's been working here for the last 6 months. And I thought it would be useful to share with you guys some of my experiences, reflections, and some of the tips that I've picked up from my time working here so far to help you guys get the most out of your time here. For those who have been here for just as long or even longer than me, feel free to chip in if you do have anything to add. So when I started this role, I knew it would be challenging. But what I didn't realize was just how much of the learning would actually not come from the medical aspect and the medical expertise, but actually from the practicalities of the human side of medicine, whilst being thrown in an unfamiliar, stressful environment. And that's really what I'll be mostly focusing on today. So one of my very first lessons was that there's absolutely no substitute for mastering the fundamentals. In hospital, you can call on somebody if you don't know how to use a piece of equipment. If you want some drugs, it automatically gets drawn up for you. But when you're out in the field, when you're in the back of the helicopter or back of the ambulance, you may be the only person who has the time to be able to do that. So although there's nothing glamorous about setting up a blood pump set or a transducer for an arterial line or drawing up post-sedation drugs, you don't want to be in a situation where your bandwidth is then taken up by trying to figure out how to do these things, how to get air bubbles out of your lines, etc. So make these tasks. So one of the very first kind of learnings, and I'm sure there's more than one of you guys in this room who has either never or only set up one of these items once in their life, and they might not be very familiar with it. So make these tasks become second nature, because when you're managing a critically unwell patient in the back of an aircraft where it's cramped, it's noisy, you're struggling to communicate with the patient, with your paramedic, the last thing you need is to be fighting with some piece of plastic. And then this job has also taught me to prepare for the unexpected. And although I haven't mastered how to change a tire yet, that does actually happen a lot more than you would expect. And what I'll never forget is actually a job which I was dispatched to quite early on, where a patient had I think some of you guys might have heard this already, where a patient had a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the face. And heading to the job, I had painted a mental image of what the scene would look like. The paramedic and I had spoken about, finally we can use the MaxFax kit, we can manage the airway, etc. But in reality, when we turned up, this was actually one of the most confronting scenes I've ever walked into. And just a word of warning, there is quite a confronting image next, which is of the patient. So not only did the patient have significant injuries, they were still alert. They'd walked to the stretcher, and there was police on scene, neighbors were out all in the street trying to see what was going on. And whilst no simulation I'd ever done could capture the full weight of this case, we weren't actually starting from zero. What we could depend on were the drills that you'd done before, the preparation you've done going into the case, the SOPs, the checklists, all of which will carry you through cases which are unexpected. So we did kind of improvise and did some pre-oxygenation just by wafting some oxygen over what we could. We managed to get secure his airway. We managed to do hemorrhage control as best as we could. So just remember all those things that you do know, the SOPs, the checklist, which you can really depend on. And then when you rock up in hospital, like we did, the plastic surgeon then asked you, did you manage to pick up his nose? And we were like, no. Another lesson I learned was always to try and think one step ahead. So always ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen to the patient in the next 10 minutes, and prepare for it and preempt it. Like I said, you're in limited space, it's noisy, there's movement, there's no backup team down the corridor who will be able to help you. So you have to, and reacting to a patient deteriorating sometimes just isn't enough, and you need to anticipate it. So be ready for what might happen and not just what's happening in front of you now. Take the extra few minutes to establish a second IV line if you need. check that you have access and you can reach for the blood products whilst you're strapped into your seat in the aircraft, and make kit available that you may need during the flight. As many of you, I believe, has probably been in a similar situation as me, where you take off mid-flight, the patient suddenly drops their bundle, and you're scrambling for blood products, etc. But if you're prepared for it, then it isn't so much of a panic, it isn't so chaotic, and it's just kind of executing a plan that you'd thought in your head, you shared with your paramedic. So just try and think one step ahead, and look at the patient kind of 5 minutes, 10 minutes from now. What's the worst thing that can happen to them? And then downtime. So I actually found the long stretches where there's no missions to go on quite strange and difficult. When I first started, you'd come into work geared up for action, and adrenaline's running through you, and then the phone doesn't ring for ages, or you see your colleagues in Wollongong getting a winch job. And you feel restless and even guilty that you're not doing much. But then you come to realize that downtime is actually not wasted time, and that's your chance to prepare properly. That's your chance to use equipment that you might not be familiar with. And actually, one of the main learnings from the most useful things I've learned from having downtime is reflecting on your previous missions with your colleagues, swapping stories. And I learned more, and I had more in some of my best insights into some of the missions are actually conversations with your colleagues in the hangar, rather than trying to reflect on it yourself. So just remember that next time you're having a bit of downtime, try and recover, and share your stories with others. And then working here has also taught me a lot about myself. Whilst there are moments of triumph, and if you've done a winch, then you're always going to be happy to share your stories about that. There's also a lot of fatigue and emotional weight from confronting cases. And this is where I've learned a lot about the importance of self-care. It's not only just eating and keeping hydrated and sleeping when you can, but also doing what you love on your days off. Another big learning point, or another thing which I found very useful, is actually to debrief honestly, not only just after good jobs, but also after the harder ones. And to accept that you can't always control the outcomes, but you can control kind of your well-being, physical well-being, mental well-being, emotional well-being, and that does help a lot. And then last but not least, it goes without saying that the CCPs we work with are extraordinary. They are your greatest assets. They are deeply experienced in the pre-hospital environment, and they just seem to be able to navigate every hospital in New South Wales without being stuck in some corridor or in some lift. I have depended on them and used them on many occasions. I leaned on them for their judgment. And this job really is a true team sport. Your role isn't about leading, but it's about contributing your piece and bringing your knowledge and integrating it with the expertise of all the others. And another thing is try not to fall into the trap of seeing patients as mission numbers, case numbers, etc. When you walk into a scene or in hospital, you're stepping into somebody's family's worst day in their life, possibly. And they're not going to remember the technical details, your ventilator settings, what drugs you've pushed, etc. What they are going to remember is what you said to them, how you treated them in that moment. So just try and remember or acknowledge the person that's in front of you or their family members around them, and not see them as just a physiology which you're trying to fix. And always carry snacks with you, because you don't want to be hungry. You don't want your CCP to be hungry either. So if you can bake, even better. And last but not least, enjoy the views and enjoy the job. That's all I have.
Any questions from the group? We've obviously got some people who are quite new to the service. Maybe it's the perfect talk for you. Kind of reinforces some of the stuff we talked about at induction, and particularly things like making sure that you use the downtime effectively and find something useful to do that. And I think there's filled with wisdom, that talk, on various things that you've learned. So, but any questions from the group?
Can I ask a question about the guy who shot space?
Yeah.
Thanks. Specifically about that guy, you said you secured the airway.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was actually easier than we thought. Like, we had prepared for a front of neck access, but after suctioning the blood, the cords were basically right there. You could see the cords. So we didn't end up using a bougie, which we also spoke about beforehand. We just went straight for the tube. But we had prepared everything for, we said, we're not going to be able to use an LMA. We're not going to be able to use anything else. So if we can't get a tube in, then our backup would be a front of neck, was what we spoke about. But surprisingly, it was one of the easiest tubes. Unfortunately, we didn't record it. Sorry. We took a photo instead of recording it.
Cool. I think that's wondrous. Well,